He didn't say much my entire life. Not the kind of man who filled silence. He showed up. That was his version of everything. Work, bills, school events. Always there. But there were things he never said. Not once. Not when I graduated. Not when I got my first job. Not when I built something that actually worked. Not even when it would have been easy. I used to notice it. Then I stopped. Or at least, I told myself I did. Because after a while, you stop expecting something that never comes. You adjust around it. You build your life without it. That's what I did. For 35 years. And then, at my mother's funeral, he asked me to step outside, looked at me for a moment, and said 4 words I had already given up on hearing. Before I tell you about what he said that day, I need to explain what he was like before it, because the sentence mattered, but the silence before it mattered more. My father was never a cruel man. That needs to be said clearly. He worked. He paid bills. He fixed things before anyone asked. If the car made a sound, he heard it first. If something in the house broke, it was handled by evening. He was reliable in the way some men are. Solid. Predictable. Present. He just wasn't expressive. Not with words. He never said I love you. Not to me. Not to my brother. Not out loud. At least not where I could hear it. He and my mother had their own rhythm. Quiet conversations in the kitchen. Practical decisions made without much discussion. She was the one who translated emotion for the rest of us. If he was worried, she knew. If he was disappointed, she knew that too. And somehow, she always expected us to know as well. He's proud of you, she would say sometimes. Usually after he had already left the room. Not often. Just enough to keep the possibility alive. I believed her, mostly because I wanted to. As a kid, I didn't think about it in complicated terms. I just noticed what was missing. Other fathers said things. At baseball games. At graduations. At backyard cookouts. Simple things. That's my boy. Good job. Proud of you. Nothing dramatic. Just enough for a kid to carry home with him. My father would stand beside me after a game, hands in his pockets, and say something like, "You kept your eye on it better today," which, from him, was probably a compliment, but it never landed that way, because I was always listening for the other words, the direct ones, the ones that would leave no doubt. I remember being 12 years old, late Saturday morning, Little League field. I hit a double into left center. Nothing special, but solid. I looked toward the fence after I got to second. He was there, cap on, sunglasses, arms crossed. He gave one short nod. That was it. On the drive home, he talked about staying balanced at the plate. He was probably trying to help. I stared out the passenger window and waited. For something else. It never came. That became the pattern. School awards. Good report cards. My first real job. The day I bought my first car with my own money. The day I bought my first house. He showed up for all of it. Or most of it. And if he couldn't show up, he asked practical questions later. How much did the roof inspection come back at? What kind of rate did they give you? When do you start? Not because he didn't care. Because practical was the only language he fully trusted. That's the part that took me years to understand. He was not empty. He was contained. Still, when you grow up around that kind of man, you learn to measure yourself strangely. Not by what was said, by what might have been meant. And that gets tiring. There's a certain kind of waiting that becomes part of your personality. Quiet. Constant. Hard to explain. You stop asking for things directly. You start hoping your life will eventually speak for you. That was probably the part one never admitted. Even to myself. I built a good life. A steady one. I worked hard. Made decent decisions. Recovered from the bad ones. There were years when I was busy enough not to think about him much. Or not to think about that specific absence. Then something would happen. A promotion. A finished project. A birthday dinner. And I would catch myself watching his face for half a second too long. Just to see if something might finally arrive on its own. It never did. Not unprompted. Not in the words I needed. And I never asked. That part belongs to me. I could tell you it was pride. Maybe some of it was. But mostly it was fear. Not fear of him. Fear of hearing the truth too clearly. Because as long as I never asked, I could keep the possibility intact. I could keep believing my mother was right. That he felt it. He just didn't say it. If you've ever built your whole adult life around a sentence someone never gave you, you already know how quiet that can make a person. If that sounds familiar, stay with me. My mother understood all of this without me explaining it. She was good at reading what people carried, especially the things they thought they had hidden well. Once, when I was in my late 20s, she was drying dishes after dinner. Just the two of us in the kitchen. My father had gone outside to look at something in the garage. Or maybe he just needed to be somewhere else for a while. She handed me a plate and said, "Your father notices more than you think." I remember smiling a little. Not because I agreed, because I had heard some version of that before. "I know," I said. Even then, it sounded incomplete. She dried another plate, then looked at me for a second. "No," she said, "you don't." That stayed with me. Not because it solved anything, because it didn't. It just made the whole thing feel older, more fixed, like she was trying to give me peace without promising change. And life moved the way it always does. Years passing in practical units. Jobs, repairs, holidays, medical appointments, birthdays. My father remained himself. Dependable, reserved, hard to read if you were waiting for softness to announce itself. My mother remained the bridge, the translator, the warmth in the room. She called more, remembered details, asked questions my father never thought to ask. How was work really? Was I sleeping enough? Did I seem tired lately? She had a way of asking ordinary questions that made honesty feel easier. So when she got sick, the whole family shifted around her without quite saying that we were shifting. At first, it was schedules, appointments, medication, rides. Then it was tone, conversations becoming more careful, pauses lasting longer than usual. My father handled it the way he handled everything. He was there, every appointment, every form, every practical decision. He kept lists, wrote things down on a folded piece of paper he carried in his shirt pocket. Medication times, numbers for doctors, dates for scans. He learned the parking layout of the hospital better than I did. Which elevator was slow, which entrance stayed less crowded after 5. He did all of it without complaint, without commentary. And even then, even in that season, he did not become verbally open. Not with me, not with anyone that I saw. My mother got thinner, quieter, then, somehow, gentler than she had already been. The last real conversation we had alone happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Hospital room, around 3:10. Rain tapping softly against the window. She asked if I had eaten. I said yes, even though I hadn't. She knew I was lying. She let it pass. Then she asked, "You know he loves you, right?" I looked down at the blanket on her lap, smoothed the crease that didn't need smoothing, and said the most honest thing I had said about my father in years. "I know he's there." She watched me for a moment, not correcting me, not agreeing either, just watching. Then she gave a small nod, the kind that says the conversation is not finished, even if the words are. A few days later, she was gone, and at the funeral, with relatives moving in slow clusters and everyone speaking more softly than usual, my father asked if we could step outside for a minute. I didn't expect him to ask that. Not there. Not that day. The reception had that same quiet rhythm most funerals have. People speaking softly, standing closer than usual, small groups forming, breaking, reforming somewhere else. I had already had the same conversation at least 10 times. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you." Different faces. Same exchange. My father had been moving through the room steadily, not avoiding people, not staying too long either. Shaking hands, nodding, saying what needed to be said, exactly the way he handled everything. I was near the back when he found me, standing beside a table with untouched coffee. He didn't say my name, just stood next to me for a second. Then, "Come outside for a minute." Same tone he used for practical things. No urgency, no emotion in it. I nodded, followed him. We walked through the side door, out into the parking lot. It was late afternoon, around 4:20, cloud cover, no direct sun, a few cars pulling in, others leaving slowly, the kind of ordinary movement that feels out of place on a day like that. We stood near his truck, not facing each other at first, just standing. He looked out toward the far end of the lot, hands in his pockets. Same posture I had seen my entire life. For a second, I thought this was going to be about logistics. What to do with the house? Who was coming by later? That kind of conversation. The kind he was comfortable having. I waited. He didn't speak right away. That wasn't unusual. He never rushed into anything. Then he turned slightly, looked at me. Really looked. Not the quick glance I was used to. Not the passing check. This was different. It lasted a few seconds longer than normal. Long enough for me to notice it and not know what to do with it. There was something in his face I didn't recognize immediately. Not softness. Not exactly. Something less contained. Then he said it. I am proud of you. 4 words. Simple. Clear. No explanation attached. No build-up. Just there. For a second, I didn't respond. Not because I didn't hear him. Because I didn't know where to put it. 35 years of waiting. And it arrives in a parking lot. On my mother's funeral. In the middle of everything else. There is no version of me that had rehearsed this moment. No prepared response. No expectation that it would ever happen. So when it did, there was nothing ready to receive it. I looked at him. Same man. Same posture. But not the same presence. He wasn't looking past me. He wasn't scanning the lot. He was just there, waiting. Not for a reaction. Just present. That was new. I felt something shift. Not suddenly. More like something settling into place. Something that had been loose for a long time. I nodded once, took a breath, and said the only thing that felt true. I know, Dad. Then after a second, I just needed to hear it. He didn't react the way other people might. No change in posture. No visible emotion. But something in his face adjusted. Slightly. Like a tension had been released. He gave a small nod. Not agreement. Not confirmation. Just acknowledgement. We stood there for a while after that. Not talking. Not needing to. Cars moving in the background. Doors closing somewhere in the distance. Muted sounds. We didn't hug. That would have been out of place. For both of us. But we stood close. Closer than we had in years. Not by design. Just naturally. Like there was no need to maintain distance anymore. After a minute or two, he cleared his throat. Looked back toward the building. Then said, we should head back in. Same tone. Same delivery. But it didn't feel the same. I nodded. We walked back together. Side by side. Not speaking. Didn't need to. When we stepped back inside, nothing had changed. Same people. Same conversations. Same soft voices. But something had shifted. Not in the room. In me. And in him. In a way that didn't need to be explained. I moved through the rest of the afternoon differently. Still saying the same things. Still having the same conversations. But there was no background question running anymore. No quiet wondering. No space left for that particular absence. It had been filled. Not gradually. All at once. And in a way that didn't undo the years before it. But didn't need to. Because it was true. That was the part that mattered. Not when it came. That it did. And as the afternoon moved on, with people slowly beginning to leave and the room thinning out, I realized something I hadn't expected. I wasn't waiting for anything from him anymore. The strange part was not what he said. It was what happened after. Nothing dramatic. No scene. No second conversation later that night. He didn't suddenly become a different man. Didn't start talking more. He didn't put a hand on my shoulder. Didn't look at me with some new softness that explained everything. He just went back inside, and I went with him. That was it. But the sentence stayed with me. Not in a loud way. In a quiet one. Like something that had been missing from a room for years had finally been put back. And now the room made sense. The reception went on for another hour or so. Maybe a little longer. Time felt strange that day. Not slow. Not fast. Just hard to measure. People kept coming over. Some of them I knew well. Some I only knew through my mother. Neighbors. Old family friends. 2 of her cousins from out of town. Everyone had a version of the same story. How kind she was. How organized she was. How she remembered birthdays no one else remembered. That was all true. She held more of the family together than any of us admitted while she was alive. Maybe because it was easier to see structure once it was gone. My brother stayed close to the front of the room, talking more than I was. He had always been better at that, better at receiving emotion directly, better at returning it. I moved between conversations, said thank you, nodded, listened, and underneath all of that, there was still that sentence. I am proud of you. It kept replaying, not because I was trying to hold on to it, because I didn't know what else to do with it. Part of me wanted to go back outside and ask him what made him say it then. Why that day? Why not earlier? Not in an accusing way. Just honestly, why now? But another part of me understood immediately that asking would ruin it. Not the truth of it, the shape of it. My father had given me something whole, small, clear, unqualified. If I pushed at it too hard, he might start explaining. An explanation was his way of retreating. So I let it stand. That evening, after most people had gone, a few of us ended up back at my parents' house. Not for long, just the way families do after funerals. No one wants the day to end exactly when it should. So people extended a little, with coffee, with leftovers, with practical tasks that don't need to be done yet. The house felt both familiar and wrong. Same furniture, same hallway runner, same dining room, chairs my mother had wanted replaced for 10 years and never did. But the center of it was gone, and every room knew it. My Aunt Linda was in the kitchen wrapping things in foil. My brother was on the phone with someone near the den. I stood by the sink for a while with a glass of water I never finished, just looking out into the backyard. The porch light was on. There were moths moving around it in slow circles. My father came into the kitchen at one point, opened a cabinet, took out 2 mugs. He set one on the counter near me without looking directly at me, then poured coffee into both. That was the kind of thing he did. No announcement, no question, just placement. I picked up the mug. Thanks, I said. He nodded once. That coffee's been sitting a while. Under any other circumstances, I might have smiled at that. Maybe I did. A little. It's fine, I said. He leaned against the counter for a second, looking toward the back door. Not at me. And there was a part of me waiting, not for another big sentence. That would have been too much. Just something. A continuation, maybe, a sign that the parking lot moment had really happened. What he said next was, "Your mother liked this roast better than the other one." I looked down at the mug in my hand. Dark coffee. Slight film on the surface. Too hot still. That sounds right, I said. He nodded again. And that was the whole exchange. But it mattered. More than I would have expected. Because it was not a return to nothing. It was a way of standing in the same space. Not forcing anything. Not backing away either. Later that night, when everyone else had left, I stayed to help stack a few dishes and take out the trash. Not because there was much to do, because leaving felt abrupt. My father stood near the table, gathering paper plates into one pile. Careful, methodical, quiet. At one point, he held one of my mother's serving bowls for a second too long, just looking at it. Then he set it down in the sink and asked, "You heading home tonight?" "Yeah," I said. He nodded. "Road's wet. Take it easy." That was how he said concern. That had always been how he said it. And for the first time in my life, I heard it correctly. Not as the absence of something better, as the presence of something real. It didn't erase the years before. I need to say that clearly. One sentence, even one I had waited 3.5 decades to hear, does not rewrite a childhood. It does not go back through graduations and birthdays and all the quiet drives home after moments that should have held more. It does not make a younger version of you feel instantly healed. That isn't how anything works. But it does change the shape of memory. Not the facts, the weight of them. Because once I knew he could say it, once I knew he had meant it, some older moments shifted. Not all of them. Some. The nod at the baseball field. The questions after my first job. The way he showed up every time something practical mattered. Those things did not become emotional speeches just because I wanted them to, but they did stop feeling empty. And that was different. That was enough to matter. I drove home a little after 10:30. Rain still coming down lightly. Street lights stretching across the windshield in soft lines. The radio off. I kept both hands on the wheel and replayed the conversation outside exactly as it happened. Not improving it. Not adding to it. Just keeping it intact. I am proud of you. I know, Dad. I just needed to hear it. Simple, clean, complete. When I got home, I didn't go straight inside. I sat in the driveway for a minute with the engine off. Not because I was overwhelmed. Not because I was trying not to cry. It was quieter than that. I was just trying to understand what it meant to receive something late and still feel it arrive exactly on time. Because that was the part one had not expected. Not the words themselves, the accuracy of them. My mother was gone. That fact was still sitting over everything. Heavy, permanent, impossible to negotiate with. And yet, in the middle of that loss, something else had been returned to me. Not to cancel the grief, not to balance it, just to stand beside it. Some truths come early and shape your life. Some come late and change it anyway. I didn't fully understand that yet. Not that night, but I could feel it beginning. And in the months that followed, it would show up in ways neither of us had the language to announce. Nothing changed right away. That would be the easy version. The version where one sentence fixes the room, where decades of silence fold neatly into understanding. That wasn't what happened. What happened was smaller, more accurate. The week after the funeral, my father called on a Wednesday evening, around 7:40. He never called just to call, at least not before that. There was usually a reason, something practical, a question about insurance, a reminder about a date. So when I saw his name on my phone, I expected that kind of conversation. I answered the same way I always did. "Hey, Dad, you home?" He asked. "Yeah." There was a pause. Not unusual. Then he said, "Just checking." That was it. Not checking what? Not checking why. Just checking. I stood in my kitchen with the phone against my ear and let that sit for a second. Because I knew what he meant. Or maybe I didn't know exactly. But I knew what it wasn't. It wasn't logistics. It wasn't obligation. It was him reaching for something he had never reached for before. Using the only words he trusted. "Everything all right?" I asked. "Yeah," he said. Then after a second, "You eating okay?" It was such an ordinary question. That was what made it matter. Nobody had ever needed to explain my father to me more clearly than that. There he was, trying. "Yeah," I said. "I'm fine." Another pause. "All right," he said. Then, "I'll let you go." The call lasted less than a minute, maybe 40 seconds. But after I hung up, I stayed where I was, hands still on the counter. Not because it was emotional in an obvious way, because it was unfamiliar. He had entered my life sideways again, not with a speech, with a practical sentence carrying something larger inside it. That became the pattern. Not every day, not even every week at first, but more than before. Enough to notice. He would call and ask whether I had heard from my aunt, or whether I had gotten the paperwork sorted, or whether the mechanic ever fixed that sound in my car. On the surface, those conversations were the same kind we had always had. Practical, brief, controlled, but the frequency was different. The timing was different. And underneath it, there was something else. Not spoken, present anyway. Once, about 3 weeks after the funeral, he called on a Sunday afternoon, just after 3. I was at the grocery store, standing in front of the produce section, trying to remember whether I needed onions. I almost let it ring, then answered. "Hey, what are you up to?" he asked. That question stopped me more than it should have, because he had never asked it like that before. Not "What are you doing about the house?" Not "Did you remember to call someone?" Just, "What are you up to?" "Store," I said. "Just picking up a few things." He made a small sound, not quite a response. Then he said, "All right." And then, almost like he had decided to add one more thing before he lost the nerve. "Don't forget coffee. You always run out." I laughed. Actually laughed. In the middle of the produce section. "Yeah," I said. "That's true." "I know," he said. And there was something in that answer that stayed with me the rest of the day. Because it was so simple and so specific. He knew. Not in the broad way parents know things. In a close way. The way you know a person because you've been paying attention. I had spent years assuming that whatever he felt, he kept too far inside to ever be useful. Now, I was starting to see something else. He had been noticing all along, just without the language I wanted. That realization was not comforting at first. I want to be honest about that. Part of it was. Part of it wasn't. Because once you understand that someone may have loved you more clearly than they ever spoke, you also have to face what that silence cost. That took me some time. I wasn't angry exactly, not in a loud sense, but I did think back through things differently. Moments I had flattened into one shape. Conversations I had filed away as evidence. My first apartment. The day I moved in, he spent 4 hours helping me carry furniture up one narrow staircase. Didn't complain once. At the end, standing by the door with sweat darkening the back of his shirt, he had looked around the place and said, "You'll do all right here." At the time, I heard that as neutral. Now, I wasn't so sure. Then there was the year I changed jobs. Left something stable for something less certain. My mother had worried. Said as much. My father had only asked, "You've thought it through?" I said yes. He nodded, then showed up the next Saturday with a toolbox because he thought the shelves in my office were uneven. None of these memories turned into speeches just because I wanted them to. I wasn't rewriting him. I was rehearing him. That's different. There's a strange kind of grief in that, too. Seeing late what was always there. Understanding it after the years when you needed it most have already passed. But there was relief in it as well. A steady kind. Because it meant the sentence outside, the funeral home, had not come from nowhere. It belonged to a longer truth. My father still didn't say much. That didn't change. When we spoke, there were still pauses. Still blunt transitions. Still whole subjects carried by half a sentence. But now, when silence came, it didn't feel empty. It felt inhabited. One evening in late October, I stopped by his house after work. He had asked if I could help him move a small table from the basement. That was the reason given. It may even have been the real reason. With him, both things were often true at once. The house looked mostly the same. My mother's chair still near the window. Magazines still stacked in the basket beside it. He hadn't rushed to change anything. I respected that. We moved the table upstairs. A narrow oak thing my mother used to keep plants on in the spring. Afterward, we stood in the kitchen. He put on water for coffee. Same mugs. Same counter. Same quiet. The light above the sink was too yellow. It had always been too yellow. He looked out the window while the kettle heated, then said, "Your mother liked having you around." I looked at him. Didn't answer right away, because I knew that sentence was not only about her. And he knew I knew. So we stood there for a second, with the kettle beginning to hum between us. And I realized he was finding his way towards something he still didn't fully know how to say. After that, things changed in ways that would have been easy to miss from the outside. That was probably why they mattered. Nothing about my father became dramatic. He did not suddenly turn into a man who narrated his feelings. He did not start saying everything he had failed to say for 35 years. That would not have been him. What changed was smaller. And because it was smaller, it felt real. He called more. Not often enough to become a new habit right away, but enough that I stopped being surprised every time his name appeared on my phone. Sometimes the calls still had a practical shape. Questions about the house. Something to do with paperwork. A date he wanted to confirm. But even those felt different now, because they no longer seemed like excuses to avoid closeness. They felt like the only doorway he knew how to use. And once I understood that, I stopped expecting him to walk through a different one. That made things easier for both of us. One Saturday morning in November, he called around 9:10. I was still in sweatpants, standing at the stove, making eggs. "You busy?" he asked. "Not really." There was a pause. Then he said, "I'm heading to the hardware store." I waited, because it felt like there was something after that. Then he added, "Thought I'd see if you wanted to come." The sentence itself was ordinary. That was the point. He had never really invited me to do things before unless something needed doing. Even when we spent time together, it was usually in the service of a task. A fence needed fixing. A shelf needed mounting. A battery needed replacing. But this was different. There was no job attached to it. Just the store? "Yeah," I said. "Give me 20 minutes. "All right," he said. And that was that. We drove there in his truck. The same one he had been driving for years. Still smelled faintly like sawdust and old coffee. The radio was on low. Some talk station neither of us was really listening to. We didn't say much on the way. That still hadn't changed, but wasn't strained. That was the difference. Silence used to feel like evidence. Now it just felt like space. Inside the store, he moved the way he always did. Purposefully. No wasted steps. He needed furnace filters. A new light switch. Something for the back gate latch. I followed him through the aisles. Sometimes beside him. Sometimes half a step behind. Just like when I was younger. At one point, he picked up 2 different brands of screws and held them for a second. Then looked at me and said, "You've probably used more of these than I have lately." It was such a small line, but I noticed it immediately. Not because of the screws. Because he was asking. He was making room for my answer as if it had value on its own. Not as something to be checked. Not as something to improve. I took one of the boxes from his hand. Looked at the size. "These'll hold better," I said. He nodded. Put the other box back. No debate. No correction. Just trust. That stayed with me longer than it should have. Maybe because I knew how rare it had once felt. Afterward, we got coffee from the place near the parking lot. A plain place. Fluorescent lights. Burnt smell near the counter. We sat by the window. Paper cups between us. Cars moving slowly through the lot. He asked about work. Not in the old way. Not, "Everything all right there?" Not busy. He asked, "How's that thing you were building going?" For a second, I didn't answer. Not because I didn't know. Because I wasn't used to hearing the question like that. He noticed. Or maybe he just waited. "It's going well," I said. "Slow in the beginning. Better now." He nodded. Then he asked, "You still think it's worth it?" That was the question. Not whether it was practical. Not whether it was safe. Whether I thought it was worth it. "Yeah," I said. "I do." He took a sip of coffee. Looked out at the lot. Then he said, "Good." No speech after that. No extra sentence. But it was enough. Because I knew what he meant now. Or at least, I knew the direction he was trying to move in. That became another pattern. Not long conversations. Not emotional ones. Just slightly different questions. Slightly shorter silences. A tone that no longer felt sealed shut. In December, he called one evening just after 8. I was on the couch with my laptop open, pretending to work. "You eat yet?" he asked. "Not yet." Pause. Then, "I made too much chili." I smiled before I answered. Because even then, even with everything that had changed, he still could not say the sentence directly. He was not asking me to come by for dinner. He was telling me there was too much chili. "All right," I said. "I can head over." When I got there, he had already set out 2 bowls. Crackers on a plate between them. We ate at the kitchen table. Not the dining room. Never the dining room unless my mother insisted. Her chair was still empty. Not formally untouched. Just obviously hers. He noticed me glance at it. Didn't say anything. Then, after a minute, he said, "She always put too much cheese in hers." I laughed softly. "Yeah, she did." He nodded once. Then added, said it made everything better. We sat with that. Not just the memory. The fact that he had offered it. That was new too. Not grief exactly. Shared grief. The kind that does not need to be announced to be understood. By then, I had stopped waiting for some larger conversation. The one where we would finally explain the years behind us. The one where he would tell me why he had been the way he was. The one where I would say what it cost. That conversation never came. And eventually, I understood that it didn't need to. Not because the past was irrelevant. Because the present had finally become honest enough to stand on its own. There's a temptation, when something arrives late, to measure it only against the years it missed. To ask whether it would have mattered more earlier. Whether it would have changed you if it had come on time. The answer is probably yes. Of course it would have. But that is not the same as saying it means less now. That was what I was learning. Slowly, quietly, in hardware stores, in parking lots, and kitchens with too much yellow light. Late things still have weight. Late truths still tell the truth. And one cold evening near the end of that year, as we stood side by side in his garage with the door half open to the dark, he said something so small I almost missed it. I was helping him put away a box of old tools. Nothing important, just handing things over one at a time. He took a wrench from me, set it in the drawer, then said, Without looking up, "You've always been steady." That was all. No lead-in, no explanation. But stopped me, because it sounded like the beginning of something he had been trying to say for a very long time. And this time, he did not leave it unsaid. He still didn't become the kind of father who said everything. That never happened. And if I tell this story honestly, that matters. Because the point is not that he transformed. The point is that he opened. Just enough. And then kept it open. That was new. That was enough to change the shape of things between us. After he said, "You've always been steady," in the garage that night, neither of us built a conversation around it. We didn't stop what we were doing. He closed the drawer. I handed him the next tool. The garage smelled like cold air and old wood. The overhead light buzzed the way it always had. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice. Then it was quiet again. He picked up a screwdriver from the workbench, looked at it for a second, put it back in the wrong drawer. I noticed. Didn't say anything. Not because it mattered, because I was looking at him differently. I was seeing a man who had spent most of his life holding things in practical containers. Work, repairs, lists, routines. And now, late in life, he was trying to move something human through those same containers. Not elegantly, but sincerely. That changed the way I heard him, and it changed the way he spoke to me. Not all at once. Never all at once. But over the next few months, there were small things. Enough small things that I stopped calling them exceptions. He called on a Tuesday evening in January, a little after 8. I answered. "Hey, Dad." He said, "You busy?" "Not really." He paused. Then, "Just wanted to see how your week was going." That question landed differently than it would have before. Not because it was deep, because it wasn't practical. No roof, no paperwork, no errand hidden inside it. Just my week. "It's all right," I said. "Bit busy, but all right." He made a small sound, the kind that meant he was listening. Then he asked, "You sleeping enough?" I smiled without meaning to, because that was my mother's question, or close enough to it. Trying till I said. He didn't say anything for a second. Then quietly, "Good." That was the whole call. Maybe 90 seconds. But after we hung up, I sat there for a while with the phone still in my hand. Not because it was emotional in some obvious way, because it was precise. A late change, but a real one. He had started asking questions that required him to care in the open, and I had started answering them without pretending not to notice. That was our version of progress. Not speeches, not repair scenes, just less distance, more contact, shorter silences. Sometimes I would stop by his house on the way home from work, not for a reason, or not only for one. He would be in the kitchen, or in the garage, or standing near the back door looking at the yard like there was something there worth studying, which there usually wasn't. I'd say, "You eating anything decent?" And he'd say, "Depends who's asking." That kind of line would have been unusual before. Not warm exactly, but lighter. He started keeping better coffee in the house. I noticed that before he said anything about it, the cheap brand disappeared, the one my mother always hated. One afternoon, I held up the new bag and said, "You finally gave in." He looked at it and said, "You complained enough." I laughed. He almost did. That was another thing. Not big laughter, not dramatic softness, just the edge coming off, a little at a time. In February, he asked if I wanted to drive out with him to the cemetery. He said it the same way he might have asked if I wanted to go pick up lumber. "Heading there Sunday. You can come if you want." I said yes. We drove out late in the morning. The sky was white, flat, cold. Neither of us talked much on the way. That still wasn't our style. But it no longer felt like a failure of something. It felt like space we both knew how to share. At the cemetery, we stood near my mother's headstone for a while, hands in our pockets, coats zipped up against the wind. He brushed a few leaves away with the side of his shoe, then stepped back. After a minute, he said, "She always said you notice things other people missed." I looked at him, didn't answer right away, because that sentence was carrying more than one thing at once. Her voice, his memory of her, his choice to say it aloud. "She noticed everything," I said. He nodded, then said, "Yeah, she did." We stood there a little longer, not talking, And I realized something in that moment that I had not fully admitted before. I had spent years wanting my father to say the exact words I needed. And when he finally did, I thought that would be the whole story. The fix, the center, the conclusion. But it wasn't. It was the opening. What mattered after that was not the sentence alone. It was what he did with the space it created. He stayed in it, awkwardly sometimes, indirectly, almost always. But he stayed. That is rarer than people think, especially for men his age, especially for men who were taught that providing was enough and naming feeling was unnecessary. He never apologized for the years before. I never asked him to. Part of that was temperament. Part of it was understanding. There are people who can turn and look directly at the wound. And there are people who can only stand closer to you after they finally admit it exists. My father was the second kind. And once I understood that, I stopped measuring him against a version of manhood he was never going to inhabit. I started measuring him by movement, and he was moving, not quickly, but clearly. By spring, the calls were normal enough that I stopped checking the screen twice when his name came up. He would ask what I was doing. He would ask how work was going. Sometimes he would mention something small he had remembered, that I liked a certain diner off Route 8, that I still took my coffee too strong, that Tuesdays were usually my longest day. Those details mattered more than they should have, maybe because they proved something simple. He had been looking longer than I knew. One evening in April, I was leaving his house after dinner. I had come by to help him move a few boxes from the basement. At least that was the official reason. I was halfway to the door when he said, "Drive safe." Then, before I could answer, "And call me when you get home. It's raining." I turned back and looked at him. Not because the request was strange, because it wasn't. It was ordinary. Ordinary in the way I'd spent years envying in other families. Ordinary in the way I had once assumed we might never be. "All right," I said. "I will." He nodded, like that settled it. I called when I got home. He answered on the second ring. "Made it back," I said. "Good," he said. Then after a second, "All right, get some sleep." And that was it. No speech. No big finish. Just care, spoken plainly. Late, but plain. That's what I keep coming back to when I think about all of it. Not just the funeral. Not just the 4 words. The months after. The proof. Because some things come late and still matter completely. The timing does not cancel the truth of them. If anything, sometimes the lateness makes you hear them more clearly. There is no illusion left by then. No fantasy. Just the thing itself. Standing where it should have stood years earlier. And somehow still standing. I used to think that if my father ever said he was proud of me, it would undo me. That I would fall apart. That would be too much. It wasn't like that. It was quieter. More accurate. It didn't undo me. It steadied something in me that had been waiting a very long time to stop waiting. And maybe that is what I carry from all of this. Not that people always become who you needed them to be. They often don't. But sometimes, if you are lucky, they move toward you before it is too late. Not perfectly. Not all the way. Just enough for the truth to cross the distance. And sometimes, that is enough for the rest of your life. If you know what it is like to wait years for one sentence, stay with me. Subscribe. There's more where this came from. And tell me this in the comments. What is something someone said to you late that still mattered completely? Because I used to think timing decided everything. Now I don't. Some truths arrive after the long wait and still land exactly where they were always meant to. There's another story I'll tell soon. It begins with a sentence I almost ignored.